Hi, and welcome to this lecture on mapping. My name is Aron, and I'm a human geographer with a long-standing interest in maps and mapping. And in this short lecture, I will talk to you about how mapping can be both an important and interesting method to use as part of your qualitative research designs. So firstly, why should you consider using mapping when planning your qualitative study? Broadly speaking, maps are visual tools for sharing information with others. Mapping or map-making can be done in a variety of different ways and contexts, and the results combine together to tell rich stories about complex relationships. The American geographer Roger Downes has referred to the map as a kind of inverted microscope, or what he calls a macroscope, which through a process of minification allows us to bring large-scale phenomena within the bounds of human vision and knowledge. In this sense, mapping can help to reveal dimensions of our existence that would otherwise not be directly accessible to us. Map-making, of course, is not just limited to the actual design and drawing of maps, but also includes data collection, analysis, and engagement with map readers. Similarly, mapping can be used in one or several phases of your qualitative research process. Firstly, mapping can be a fruitful method for qualitative data collection, especially in combination with other qualitative methods such as interviews. Secondly, mapping can be used to organize and explore and analyze your qualitative data and provide insight into important spatial relationships in the data that might otherwise not be apparent. This type of analysis is generally referred to as spatial analysis, and today much of it happens through the use of digital mapping software known as Geographic Information Systems, or GIS. Finally, maps can be used to present and communicate important spatial dimensions of your research findings. Today, with the development of widely available, easy-to-use online mapping platforms, new opportunities are arising for presenting research findings in interactive ways through digital maps. Later on in this lecture, I will provide you with some concrete examples of how researchers have mobilized mapping for collecting, analyzing, and presenting qualitative data. But before we turn to some examples of mapping practices as part of qualitative research, we need to consider a question which has important implications for how we work and incorporate mapping into our research projects. This question is, what is a map? A conventional definition of a map would be that it's simply a representation of a part of the Earth's surface. In this commonplace understanding, maps are visual documents that seek to communicate a two-dimensional representation to a map reader of something that's understood to be already objectively out there in the world. Such a view is strongly associated with the idea of map-making as an expert-driven practice that seeks accurate and truthful depictions of the world, and with the view of maps as truth documents that simply tell us about how this world is. Alongside this traditional definition, I want to introduce what we can call a post-representational definition of maps. Drawing on structuralist and post-structuralist theories, critical and historical researchers in the 1980s and early 1990s began to challenge the representational view of maps as truth documents. Showing, for example, how map-making had been central to the exercise of modern state and colonial powers, scholars began to argue that rather than simply representing the world, maps in map-making actively participate in and become instruments for its creation. On the basis of such a post-representational view, professional cartographers have increasingly been challenged for the sole custody of map-making. This has opened up for acknowledgement and acceptance of a wider variety of map-makers and map-making practices as important for both understanding and also making the worlds we inhabit. This distinction and shift is important to acknowledge because it has in many ways paved the way for using mapping as a viable approach to qualitative research in a variety of contexts. Now, let's turn to some examples of how mapping can be used and has been used in qualitative research. An early example of how mapping as a method for qualitative data collection is the work of the American urban planner Kevin Lynch, who in the 1950s conducted a 5-year study on the perceptions of urban environments and urban form in 3 American cities. In the study, Lynch asked research participants to draw a mental map of their city and then give descriptions of their everyday life in it. Through this kind of grassroots mapping, Lynch was able to collect rich data about people's experiences of the modern city, data that became the basis of his now infamous, famous 1960s book, The Image of the City. A more recent example of mapping as a method for collecting data can be found in the proliferation of different counter-mapping initiatives described by Dalton and Stallman. Counter-mapping can be understood as a community-centered and participatory research process that allow marginalized communities to draw on their everyday experiences and knowledge to challenge dominant narratives about, for example, the territories they inhabit. In countermapping, mapmaking is used as a collaborative research tool that facilitates conversations, knowledge sharing, and storytelling about individual as well as collective experiences of space, generating a wealth of qualitative data. Importantly, countermapping requires careful consideration of the ethics of mapping in order to ensure that the safety of those communities involved. The utility of mapping in qualitative research is, however, not just limited to the collection of primary data, but it can also be used to explore spatial dimensions of your already collected data. For spatial analysis, which simply put is concerned with the location of objects in space and their interrelationships, you may be able to reveal patterns and relationships in this data that would otherwise remain hidden. One approach to this is so-called geovisualization, which involves modifying or transforming qualitative data, such as interviews, in order to be able to represent the spatial dimensions in this data in the form of a map. This map, which is called Twitter tongues, is one example of this kind of geovisualization, where millions of tweets have been analyzed for both language and geographic location, and then displayed in the form of a map that shows us what minority languages are predominant in different areas of New York City. Another approach to exploring and analyzing the spatial dimensions of qualitative data is through so-called hyperlinking. This approach involves linking qualitative data such as texts or images to specific geographic locations or objects on a map, most often using specific GIS software. The advantage of hyperlinking is that it preserves the qualitative data in an unmodified form, facilitating more in-depth analysis and exploration. One example of this approach is the following map by Emma Arnold, who's a researcher here at the University of Oslo. Based on the data from her long-standing research into street art in Oslo, this map shows us the locations of a set of similar tags, allowing us to simultaneously view the photographic data of those tags as well as their geographic distribution. For more advanced users, there also exists a number of ways to integrate qualitative analysis software such as Atlas TI with the mapping and spatial analysis capabilities of GIS, something I, however, will not go into in this video. Finally, if you're interested in more examples of how mapping can be used to analyze and present qualitative research, please check out some of the links found in conjunction with this video.